You are at the Ananke session with envisaging an inclusive future for the girl child. We're at the Girl Summit, and this is our fireside chat with the one and only Sara Hayat. Sara is a lawyer and a consultant. She specializes in climate change law and policy, and she takes special interest in the inequitable impacts of climate women in Pakistan and has designed a climate change narrative for Pakistan and is working to highlight the nexus between climate change and human rights. Whereas policy and legislative updates are essential for long-term sustained change, their impact is limited without proper awareness. She's a proud member of Climate Action Pakistan, which organized the first.
We've lost Nida. What I can do is I can just start talking a little about what climate change, how it impacts women till we get the whole thing going. I just want the organizers to let me know if that's all right, please. Right, so I've been told by the organizers that I should just start speaking a little. Right, so I do, as Nida told you, work and focus on climate change and within Pakistan mostly, and the inequitable impacts on women in particular. Now, I was asked what, like, because I work as a public speaker, also raising awareness on climate change. What I'm going to do is, in Nida's absence, who I can't see, and she was most excited about this panel, unfortunately. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of questions that I routinely get asked in my talks by students or government officials or those in the private sector or even in drawing rooms. So a lot of people ask me what gender justice and climate change really are and how they link together. Well, how climate change affects you is a very strong function of your social standing, of your social positioning, your financial health, your gender, your ability to control and access resources. And so, which is why, in effect, climate change ends up being or impacting countries that are developing or not that economically strong a lot more, with which have a larger population of more vulnerable or marginalized people. But in essence, climate change is inequitable and it's a twofold thing. One, that it affects people who have done the least to contribute to it more. And two, that even within these people or within the marginalized segments, it affects women and children, and within children, girls more. And it should be clarified from the outset, of course, that when I talk about marginalized segments, those who are from a racial or ethnic or religious minority, or those who are disabled, or those who are single, even single mothers, they are impacted much, or even on a sexual orientation. Everybody who is in a minority is affected far more than those who are not. And the best way to discuss the impacts, the gendered impacts of climate change, is actually just to give examples of what happens, or the direct impacts on the ground. And these impacts are by and large true for, I believe, most of the developing world. So Bangladesh, India, and of course, some of these countries are more economically strong than others, but culturally and economically, those countries which are on the same pedestal or the same level tend to experience climate change in similar, or the impacts of climate change in similar ways. So in a lot of these countries, especially in South Asia and Southeast Asia also, it is a cultural norm that women will look after the house and or the household, and are responsible for looking after it. And looking after the children as well. What this means is that they will have to go and get water and firewood. And with climate change causing drastic water scarcity and also depleting firewood and natural resources, women are unable to complete domestic chores. And you would think that this is a very small thing when I talk about it like this, but it actually isn't. These women have limited skill sets, and they feel very strongly about not being able to accomplish or do something that they want to do, or that they have been sort of that they are acclimatized to doing. It also takes a huge impact on their mental health. Then water scarcity like for example, in Pakistan, an Oxfam report now established that women are walking in rural areas of Pakistan. Women walk an average distance of 2 kilometers to get water, and this is sometimes multiple times a day. And they will carry water back on metal pans and pots on their heads, and then they'll complain of backaches, they'll complain of headaches, of hair loss, and it takes a huge physical toll on them. In this pursuit, when they are going to get water or are trying to access firewood, they are more vulnerable to sexual harassment and sexual abuse. They are also more vulnerable to attacks by wild animals and snakes. I have myself met women in parts of interior Sindh who have said that they are scared to do this, but they say they have no option. Then climate change is directly impacting women's source of livelihood. A lot of women in rural areas of Pakistan have limited skill sets. This means that they rely for their source of income, or whatever contribution that they can make financially to the household is generally linked to the agricultural output, or to looking after rearing livestock, or to fisheries. And with climate change impacting agriculture, with fisheries getting destroyed and due to warmer water, with livestock getting infected by diseases, not surviving, altering weather patterns, with drought, with natural disasters exacerbated by climate change, a woman's source of livelihood is directly impacted. And in many parts of the developing world, these women have never been allowed to go and gain an extra or additional skill set, or go work in an office, or travel for jobs, or travel for work. So for them, this is it. Like, they've actually lost the only source of income that they could have generated. Then climate change induced migration has additional impacts on women, and very severe ones. These impacts are, of course, exacerbated if the woman is pregnant, or from an ethnic minority, or disabled in any way. These impacts are also felt worse by women who are younger or adolescent. So climate change-induced migration generally happens, either it's permanent, and it generally happens because people can no longer earn a livelihood from the place they're in. Generally, people who are living along the coastal belt, or those who are now living in drought-infected areas, or where flooding or natural disasters have ruined their primary source of income or livelihood. So seasonal migration generally happens when women will be left behind and without any choice, and men will go to earn some kind of income. And they will go work on fields, or go work as laborers, and then they will come back. But if the woman is left behind, then she is more exposed to natural disasters, and she's left more vulnerable to sexual harassment and sexual violence. She also has to look after her children and the elderly in the family who are left behind with her, while she has limited financial resources and limited support. If the woman goes or accompanies the men to work on fields during seasonal migration, these women complain of a loss of privacy, of their privacy being violated, of their health being violated, because they will have to sleep with men, and a lot of men they are not related to, on fields in makeshift sort of accommodation, generally out in the open. I've met some women who complain about very high rates of urinary tract infections, because these women cannot, or they don't feel comfortable going to relieve themselves during the daytime, and so they'll wait when men have gone to sleep, and then they'll sort of go about looking after their personal health. And these women then say that they can't sleep because they have to look after their children, and because they continuously stress that at night some wild animal might attack their children or their spouse, that vector-borne diseases which are on a rise due to climate change, like dengue and malaria. So they keep sort of, because women are primary caregivers or caretakers in our part of the world, they get, these are all things that these are all sort of jobs or things that come up that fall on their side. And whilst the men are concentrating solely on just earning or earning a livelihood. And this is not to say that these women will not help out in the fields in the morning. They will, and that is on top of everything else that they will do, and on top of losing their sleep. Now, there are studies that say that that climate change, in fact, there are very sort of strong corroborated studies that say that natural disasters impact women a lot more than they impact men. In Bangladesh, when cyclones hit, 14 times more men survived than women. In Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, when the tsunami came, the ratio of men surviving to women was 3-1. In Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, when the tsunamis and the cyclones came, more women, fewer women than men survived. And in fact, these women then continued to suffer the consequences of it in their in camps, in refugee camps that they would be put in. And by refugee camps, I mean in sort of makeshift camps that to help them with disaster, to provide them a disaster relief assistance. The same was true with Ethiopia. When the drought hit, women were more exposed to sexual violence in these camps, especially when they had to travel longer distances to get water. Now, just going back to the first point, why more men than women survive, it is because in many of these developing countries, women are never allowed to learn how to swim, whereas men can go out and learn sort of basic life skills. So more women end up dying. Then another reason that's been identified is that women will waste precious evacuation time looking or collecting their family, collecting their children and even personal belongings, whereas men will generally tend to sort of swim to safety. A third reason that has also been very strongly identified is that a lot of men are not comfortable with women. A lot of men are not comfortable with women from their families being rescued by men who they are not related to while their clothes are wet. So these men would actually just allow these women to die instead of being saved by men who would see them with their clothes wet and sticking to their bodies. Nida, I'm so glad that I can see you. I just kept rambling on.
Yes, no, I'm so glad that you took charge and, basically addressed our very first question. And the impacts on women clearly are, doubly sort of disadvantaging women, because it's not just the climate change that impacts them, but also their gender and our gender-centric patriarchal norms that then impact them. And these are very harrowing, details that you've shared with us. But are the impacts on the girl child different, and in addition to the impacts on women? And if so, what are those?
The impacts on women sort of trickle down on the girl also, and like it is true. If the primary caregiver, the way they are impacted, the children end up getting impacted accordingly by and large. But there are some impacts that are exclusive to girls that arise from climate change. For example, a lot of girls are more vulnerable to human trafficking when climate change impacts become extreme in a region. Of course, it links to loss of livelihood and an economic sort of drought that hits the region and then the families. Girls are pushed into child marriage a lot earlier. If families start losing their income, because climate impacted families, when they start losing their income, will want to get their girls married off first so as to shed that responsibility. Whereas men who are already married might actually want to divorce women so as to decrease their financial burden of looking after them. Then girls who are in disaster relief camps are more exposed to sexual harassment, more sexual violence. They don't have access to sanitary care, and the cycle is vicious. Really, these girls, when they are sort of lack of education, so a lot of these girls are pulled out of school. When they pulled out of school, because if the finances are only sufficient to sort of to send either boys or girls to school, most families will opt to send boys to school. Then with the additional burden of completing household chores, which is getting water, firewood, a lot of
Yeah,
women will want the girls to help out, so they'll pull girls out of school.
true.
Then a lot of girls, so they lose out on education, and when they lose out on their opportunity of being educated, or even of just being children, these girls get trapped in a vicious cycle of sort of intergenerational cycle, systemic, where then they can never end up escaping their poverty strata. They nobody gets to tell them that they can family planning. They end up being pushed into child marriages, early marriages. They don't acquire any skill sets. And so the impacts on them are extremely, extremely dire, really.
Yes, and long term impacting, of course, not just them, it doesn't end with them, and then the sort of trickle down to other generations. And then, of course, the resource depletion that we face in terms of, child marriage and then early pregnancy, adding to the reduced generation gap between generations, which then obviously adds to the resource depletion and, puts pressure on the state of Pakistan as well, because, it's all kind of linked in a circle. So now Pakistan, of course, we understand that's one of the most highly impacted
Right.
countries, from climate change, and of course we already are a patriarchal society. So all of these impacts that you have mentioned are quite amplified in the context of Pakistan. But in the developed world, or those countries or those places which are less vulnerable to, say, climate change, what kind of impacts do we experience there? What kind of gender justice and climate change related factors do we see there? Or are these the same as in Pakistan, elsewhere in the world as well?
Well, I mean, because most developed countries fall a little lower on the spectrum of being climate impacted, the effects on them are not quite as dire. But you can definitely look at some parts of the United States, for example, where, and I said this in the beginning of when you hadn't joined us as yet. I was telling everybody that even within women, marginalized segments, ethnically marginalized, racially marginalized, they are impacted more. And so, for example, in the US, the African American community and then women from the African American community are impacted a lot more. And part of the reason is that because there is systemic poverty, like they've been pushed into systemic poverty, the African American community will end up living in areas that are cheaper, where housing or real estate is cheaper. Then these areas are generally on or in areas that are more exposed to, let's say, flooding or cyclones. And then so the impact of climate change on them in the developed world is quite is very is sort of, like, is quite profound, really. And then a lot of women within in the developed world who have to earn and look after themselves and look after their children, and then say, if they are, let's say, within an economically marginalized segment, then climate change will directly impact them also. If they're living on the coast, if they're exposed to natural disasters, if there is a shortage of raw materials, if the climate change starts impacting the economy, then these women will get impacted a lot more than other stratas or other genders.
That's true. So basically, by and large, we are saying that the impact on women and girls is pretty much, very similar, given the context, because when a climate change related calamity would strike, it would have very similar impacts, whether it's Pakistan or whether it's US, because generally of the class of women and how marginalized they are, and obviously it would exacerbate, and the extent would probably vary, but by and large we see that across the board there are very similar consequences that women experience. So are there any ways that we can diminish this gap, or we can somehow push more women forward in terms of the adaptive mechanisms or the strategies are concerned? How can we, address these challenges, and how can we have more women, be represented?
Well, I mean, the most important thing, like you said, is to have women representation when you in when climate change policy or law or legislation is being created and implemented, because only a woman I've seen can really understand the plight of another woman. Like nobody else can understand what a woman is going through. Small things that need to be put in an adaptation policy, such as, or in a disaster management policy, such as access to sanitary care. I think only a woman can think about these things. So you really need more women representation. You need women who will be in leadership positions. You need women who will, then you need a lot of education. You definitely need more climate impact related education that can be dispelled out to girls at a primary age, to schools, to children, but exclusive for girls, I would at least say. You need your policies to be gender responsive. So you, like Pakistan, for example, has a climate change policy, but we need our adaptation mechanisms to be strongly focused towards more the groups that are more inequitably impacted. Then you need for mitigation measures to come into effect. We need women to be given equal training as men. Women should be taught about renewable energy. Women should be given skills into managing solar panels, and so women should have those kind of opportunities. And then I think one thing that would really, really make a difference is if there was more data that was gathered on the inequitable impacts of climate change. And I speak very strongly about this from Pakistan, where we lose out on actually putting any action into effect because we don't have enough data to substantiate it.
That's true, and it's unfortunate to see that even though, of course, COVID-19 is not, I mean, it could be linked to climate change at some level, but there's not enough study on that. But even in that context, we saw that women were seriously missing from the policies and the committees that were established by the government of Pakistan as a response to address any of the alleviation methods or supportive methods. And in the quarantine centers also, for example, we saw that the gendered policy was missing, and women's particular concerns and needs were not addressed. So are there any steps or activism on ground that Climate Action PK is undertaking to ensure that more women voices are heard, particularly in the context of Pakistan? And also then, like as you mentioned, that Pakistan has not really contributed to the climate change as much as it's actually being impacted by it. So is there any assistance from the developed countries or the nations who are better able to facilitate in developing response strategies that are there with a gendered lens? And how are we supporting girls and women practically on ground? Are there any schemes? Are there any, is there any legislation being passed? What efforts are underway?
Wow, that's a really detailed question. I will take it stepwise and quickly. I think we're running out of time. So, well, the Paris Agreement does identify both human rights and gender inequality, which means that funding that the developed world, so to speak, has to receive under the Green Climate Fund can very well be channeled, or a substantial portion can be channeled towards gender equality or to control the gendered inequality of climate change. I don't think too many countries take it like that, though. And I believe Pakistan might not have prioritized it either. But so our policies do recognize, like a climate change policy 2013 in Pakistan does mention the impacts on women, but whether these policies translate into actual actions on the ground is something that's that we just don't see enough.
So we have the climate change minister who's a female. Has that helped Pakistan?
Well, I think,
Why are we not prioritizing this despite having a female minister?
well, I feel like a lot of ministers are just not guided properly. And I personally like that we have a female for a climate change minister, as a climate change minister, even at a federal level, but she definitely needs better guidance and better members around her. And Climate Action Pakistan, might I say, has on multiple occasions suggested to the Ministry of Climate Change that they engage our voices to for whatever help that they or guidance that we can give.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. I mean, it's amazing to see that young people like you are invested in this, and of course, we definitely need more people from all walks of life to be looking at climate change with with the grassroots level impact that it causes, because it's not just the women, as you mentioned, it's any marginalized class will be at the most risk from it. So I guess there needs to be more awareness on ground for any proper sort of actions and response to be developed. So what are the ways, some of what can you suggest to the younger people? What can they do in their current and existing capacity and sphere of influence to address and mitigate the impacts of climate change, particularly on vulnerable communities and classes of persons such as women and girls?
Well, like I think for younger people and younger children, awareness is key at this point, which is why summits like Ananke are so important. Like even I always say in my public speaking that if I've left the room and left two people more aware of what's happening, like my day I've done my good deed and I've done my job correctly. So for younger people, what we really need is awareness, not just about climate change in general, but just also about the nuances of climate change, especially about the impacts on girls. Then younger people should definitely come out and protest. And I know COVID has made that very difficult, but the pressure on governments to move towards a zero carbon economy, to prioritize climate change, just has to be kept strong. We cannot let that dwindle, not even in the face of a pandemic. It's just not an option. Then younger children should read up on it. They should create awareness for themselves. They should talk to their parents about it. I mean, we all know that right now, children know more about climate change than their parents. So instead of like the information trickling down, it actually has to go from them upwards. And I saw that children actually managed to do that. They convinced their parents to about the importance of climate change. So they should definitely do that. And then I think for Pakistan and I'm going to speak even for Bangladesh, large parts of India, for most developing countries, girls should be and women problems should be brought to the forefront, climate change related or otherwise, because it is our cultural mindset that we keep pushing women to the back and everything related to them. It just doesn't work for climate change, because without women, I tell you, we cannot manage climate change. Without women participation, even at a very micro level, a household collapses without women. No men here in our parts of the world just don't raise children, And I'm not talking about a few men in urban cities sort of here and there, but like in our countries at large. So we need to save women first in order for anything else, including our economy, to survive.
I think that's a very interesting thought, probably our final thought, and before I take your last message and last thoughts on this. But I was reading up on this, and you're right in saying that the unique grassroots level knowledge that women have, even related to agriculture, for example, is something that can really help and help reverse the impacts of climate change as well. So it's not just going to benefit women or us as persons or as individuals, but will actually that knowledge, if harnessed properly, can actually reverse climate change for all. So there's definitely a need to tap into that resource. Thank you so much, Sara. With that, we'll just want your final thoughts and comments and any messages that you may have for the governments, for the young girls out there who are listening to you, for anyone. Thank you so much for your time. We'll end on your final thoughts and message.
Oh, thank you, Nida. My pleasure to be here. I wish I was talking about a happier topic. Like I said, I hope somebody learned something. I hope somebody will want to research more on what I've said and increase their knowledge. And don't at any point feel like you as a single entity cannot do anything about climate change. You can. Even you just raising your voice on social media, even you talking to your family members, to your children, to your siblings, friends about climate change, is you actually doing something about it. And as far as the impacts or the inequitable impacts on vulnerable communities, on gender, it's something that, it's a conversation topic that almost always gets covered, but so please start injecting it into your discourse, and I am always available if anybody wants to ask any questions via email or on social media. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful session. I'm sure we are a lot more enlightened, particularly, where developing the connection between climate change and gender justice is concerned, because our justice sector and generally the way everything is planned in our society, particularly in the context of countries like Pakistan and South Asia, of course, the gendered perspective is mostly missing from all our response actions. So thank you so much for the advocacy you do on this. Thank you so much for your time. We'll hopefully be in touch again at another session on this, creating the kind of awareness.
Yes.
But for now, thank you so much for joining us at the Ananke Girls Summit. On behalf of Team Ananke, I'm Nida Usman Chaudhary from Lahore Education and Research Network. Sorry, I couldn't have a proper introduction in the beginning, so I'm just going to close with this thought that we are committed to climate justice, we are committed to gender justice, and we hope that you will join us in the quest. Thank you so much.